Good afternoon. I'm your host, Eric Bullwitz, an instructor with the Behavioral Science Division at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers, FLETC, in Glencoe, Georgia. Welcome to the Psychologically Speaking broadcast, where on the first Thursday of each quarter, we engage in continuous, conscious conversations. On behalf of the Behavioral Science Division, I would like to thank you and our special guest for being part of today's conversation, False Confessions, what every interviewer should know. We will discuss the false confession phenomenon, what a false confession is, how false confessions can occur, and best practices to mitigate false confessions. This is a live broadcast, and I encourage each of you to participate by asking questions throughout our conversation via the chat board. Our guest speakers, who will be formally introduced shortly, and I will answer your questions at the end of our broadcast. The Psychologically Speaking broadcast supports our Critical Communication Skills Instructor Training Program, CCS-ITP. The CCS-ITP is designed to enhance law enforcement communication skills and improve response to community members who are mentally ill or experiencing a mental health crisis by utilizing rapport-based strategies and techniques to de-escalate stressful situations. The CCS-ITP is not designed to teach, train, or instruct law enforcement personnel or attendees to diagnose or treat individuals with mental illness or in mental health crisis. Our program is research-based, designed and developed utilizing research that was conducted under the February 2018 Government Accountability Office Survey, Executive Order Number 13929, Safe Policing for Safe Communities, the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, and a FLETC Needs Assessment Survey. I want to welcome and introduce our special guests, Dr. Danzer, Dr. Beyer. Thank you for being part of today's broadcast. Dr. Graham Danzer is a research-informed, multidisciplinary trained forensic psychologist with over 18 years of experience. He has testified as an expert witness in 30 criminal proceedings, including 12 homicide cases in the last 8 years. His areas of competency include interviewing, behavioral science, behavioral analysis, detecting deception, criminology, multidisciplinary intervention, crisis responding, research, rehabilitation, assessment, mitigation, and management of violent and threatening behavior. He regularly conducts forensic assessments of mental health, mental illness, substance abuse, response style, severe personality constructs, and violence risk. Dr. Danzer has provided innovative training, teaching, and expert consultation to senior officials and representatives within the state and federal government. He has published 5 textbooks and 1 book chapter, 22 peer-reviewed journal articles, and facilitated 32 presentations at professional conferences. His accomplishments have been recognized via 19 merit-based commendations and awards from 2006 to the present. Dr. Danzer holds a doctorate in clinical psychology from Alliant International University, California School of Professional Psychology. Dr. Danzer's foreign languages include Arabic and Spanish. Dr. Bradford J. Beyer retired from the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 2023 after 27 years of service. During this time with the FBI, Dr. Beyer has served as a special agent in the Newark, Detroit, and Washington, D.C. field offices and investigated a wide array of criminal and national security matters. He also served as a certified FBI polygraph examiner for 18 years and a certified FBI crisis negotiator for 8 years. Dr. Beyer holds a bachelor's degree in criminal justice, a master's degree in criminal justice, a certificate of graduate study in the psychophysiological detection of deception, a master's degree in forensic psychophysiology, and a doctorate in psychology with forensic specialization. Dr. Beyer is also a contributing faculty member teaching criminal justice matters at Walden University. He has provided legal consultation and expert witness services regarding issues relating to interviewing and interrogation, false confessions, and polygraph. Dr. Beyer has researched, published, and provided instruction on a variety of issues to include polygraph, interviewing and interrogation, false confessions, crisis negotiation, forensic psychophysiology, and a variety of forensic psychology and criminal justice topics. At present, he also owns and operates Federal Polygraph Investigations, a private polygraph company offering polygraph testing services throughout the state of Michigan. Thank you both so much for joining me in this discussion. I'm excited to hear about your thoughts about this topic. I encourage everyone viewing to join the conversation and submit your questions throughout the broadcast. We will answer them in the order they are received and as time permits. I'd like to get started with Dr. Beyer. I've heard the term false confession phenomenon increase in use during my career, particularly the latter half. Could you explain what is the false confession phenomenon and what have you learned from your research?
Certainly, and I appreciate, Eric, you inviting us down here and BSD for having this conversation about this very important topic. I believe the false confession phenomenon really is an offshoot of the wrongful conviction issue. As many of us know, sadly in this country, there are many people who have been investigated, they have been charged, they have been convicted, and they've been sentenced for crimes that they didn't actually commit. So this wrongful conviction problem has actually led to the creation of various advocacy groups to help address the issue. Probably the most well-known is the Innocence Project. For those who are listening who may not know what the Innocence Project is, it's a national litigation and public policy organization that uses advancements in modern DNA technology to exonerate people who've been wrongfully convicted of crimes they didn't actually commit. With this, through the Innocence Project, we've started looking more deeply into what causes wrongful convictions. There are various reasons behind that. One of those is sometimes you'll get witness or informant perjury. They'll perjure themselves on a stand, and as such, an innocent person might be wrongfully convicted. Sometimes you have defense attorney misconduct. They're not doing a good job providing defense services for their client. There's times where you have prosecutorial misconduct. For example, you might have a prosecutor that doesn't pass on exculpatory information to the defense, which is obviously problematic. There's times where you have police officer misconduct, where they're not doing their investigations properly. They're beating or torturing interview subjects. They're not passing on exculpatory information. And then you certainly have the last two that I think are the most important is misidentification of subjects by witnesses and victims, and then you have false confessions. Now, what's interesting in this, as you look through the actual information and you look through the data that the Innocence Project puts out, about 75% of wrongful convictions are caused by misidentification of the subject by a victim or eyewitness. And in my research looking at that, more than 80% of those are actually caused by rape victims. So it's interesting that more focus isn't being placed on the false identifications made by rape subjects. Instead, what we tend to focus on is law enforcement. And that kind of makes sense from a standpoint that most of the research and study comes from the defense side of our adversarial criminal justice system. So I think it's a little more palpable and a little easier to attack police officers for their interrogative techniques than it is to address the issue concerning rape victims and the information they're providing. So what we have then is through the Innocence Project data and groups like that is it's often reported within the literature that 25 to 30% of wrongful convictions are caused at least in part by a false confession. So that statistic is often touted within the academic literature to suggest that false confessions are a frequently occurring problem. But it's important to realize it's not just academia that's putting this through as well. All you have to do is turn on your Netflix subscription service, start streaming, and you're going to see a ton of documentaries and things like that, like When They See Us, or the Amanda Knox story, or Making a Murderer, or the confession tapes, the Innocence Files, things like this. So this concept that false confessions happen routinely has not only made its way into popular culture, it exists within the legal system as well. And what we're left with is this phenomenon, this belief that false confessions happen routinely, and they are caused by the interrogative efforts of law enforcement officers.
No, I appreciate that, Doctor. Dr. Dancer, do you have any thoughts or comments that you'd like to add?
Something I'm going to elaborate on a little bit later on that I think will be beneficial in my work, primarily in evaluating individuals who are accused of crimes and to determine whether they're competent or not. Something that makes disclosure a lot more encouraged in a sense is that there is no risk that what the person tells me that it can later be used to facilitate their prosecution. So that I get often quite rich interview data about what actually happened. And
Okay.
something I'm going to talk about a little bit later on that I think will add to the dialogue and will hopefully be beneficial for officers is that there is a way that some of the aspects of proceedings really leading up to arrest and afterwards probably contribute to more in the way of what we would think about as false confessions than we might otherwise assume. The number of
Okay.
people who ultimately plead guilty that may not have actually done it. That there was maybe an arrest because a witness had said that, like Dr. Bayer talked about, there was somebody who said, this is the person who did it. And that's some evidence, but it wouldn't ordinarily be assumed to be very strong evidence.
Right.
Going also in the direction of sex crimes, there's the controlled call phenomenon, where the victim will call up and say, look, I don't want you to get in trouble. I want you to take responsibility for this. And I have evaluated the trial competency of many who, in my best judgment, what it would appear to be is that they made incriminating statements because the alternative to not doing so would be too great of a consequence. And
Okay.
even though that may sound peripheral to the subject of false confessions, it's a related subject that warrants some discussion in this topic that is both timely and of great consequence to those who it affects.
Okay, that's interesting. So in a way, part of the system itself can contribute to a false confession in some instances.
It can cause incidents that I think we should think about along those same lines, because the thing that we are probably all concerned about here is that if there are people who are saying that they did it and they really didn't, the person who did do it is still out there.
Okay.
And that there's been research findings that say that in those cases where there has been something of a false confession, the person who is still out there doing it is a very high recidivist.
Okay.
That they are, it's not just that they got away with this, they've been getting away with other things as well.
Wow. That's definitely concerning. Well, thank you for that. Dr. Dancer, I have a question for you as well. Just like I observed the term false confession phenomenon increase during my career. Also, I heard a lot of talking about and information on the law enforcement interview techniques and how they have evolved, particularly the term science-based interviewing. And I was wondering if you could, based on your research and experiences, share some of the significant events leading to the evolution of science-based interviewing and explain any relationship between this evolution and the false confession phenomenon.
The backstory of this issue is important because it's very hard often for people to believe, for judges to believe, for people in the jury box to believe that somebody would admit to doing something that they didn't when there is so much consequence to doing so, that level of what would appear to be irrationality just seems so far-fetched. Like, come on, nobody's going to do this. The problem is the Salem witch trials. People did it all the time. The thing that got a movement forward towards, we got to do something about this was in the Korean War when soldiers were captured. They were made to confess to improbable crimes on television, and it caused a lot of scare in the government, widespread in society. After 9/11, there were a number of times where the accused 9/11 plotters and masterminds were subjected to waterboarding, other very harsh techniques. We know that they said that they did things that they did not. So my larger point is, and I think it's important to keep this in context, that how often is this really happening day to day? But one of the bigger issues that I'm going to be trying to drive home in my portion of this is that this is a very high consequence issue.
Yes.
That this costs a lot, and it has happened in the past, and I think what's probably even more important is that this is something that law enforcement can do something about. This is not a problem that is not fixable through the tools that, in my belief, law enforcement already has within them.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you. I appreciate that. Dr. Bayer, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Well, I agree with Dr. Danzer that obviously there has been concern with this over the years and way interrogations are approached. What's interesting in this and the fact is obviously when you look at a lot of these cases of wrongful convictions, some of these date back 50 years. And during that 50-year time period, there's been a lot of professionalization of not only law enforcement in general, but certainly law enforcement interrogative techniques. And I know going around the country and talking on this topic, I often give the example that when my mother was pregnant with me back in 1970, so we're talking 55 years ago, she became so anxious about her pregnancy that the doctor said, hey, what we'd like you to do, just go home, put your feet up, have a cup of coffee, and smoke a cigarette. So can anybody imagine a doctor today telling their pregnant patient to go home and smoke a cigarette? But are we going to judge doctors today based on what doctors did 50 years ago?
Okay.
And I think it's also important to keep in mind, are we going to judge law enforcement on what they do today based on what law enforcement may have done 55 years ago or so? But again, the nice thing is I think there has been a certain degree of professionalization, and trainings like this and conversations like this have helped contribute to that.
All right. No, that makes sense. Dr. Beyer, so while we're talking about the false confessions, what is a false confession? And we mentioned it a little earlier. Why is it often so hard for people to believe that someone would confess to a crime that they did not commit?
I think the best thing to do when looking at a false confession is to identify what an actual confession is, what a truthful confession is. And I like the definition that's often posted in the research, which identifies a confession as a detailed written or oral statement in which an individual admits to some transgression, often acknowledging guilt for a crime. In this, there are various places we tend to see as human beings confessions take place. One of those being within the religious context. A lot of religions have the belief that if we confess our sins, it helps to remove those barriers between us and God and brings us closer and allows us to have a more spiritual life. The second place we tend to see confessions is within the psychoanalytic context, which an individual who's seeking mental health treatment might come forward with a difficult memory or something that they engaged in, and this release brings about catharsis. It brings them closer to psychological healing. The third place we tend to see confessions is within the criminal justice system. Now, what's interesting, there have been some that have suggested within the academic literature that those first two, the religious context and then the psychoanalytic context, confession is a good thing. However, in the criminal justice system, the confession is only bad because it brings that person one step closer to their wrongful conviction, if it is a false confession. Now, there are, to the contrary, we know what a confession is. A false confession is really exactly the opposite. This is when somebody accepts responsibility for a crime that they didn't actually commit.
Okay.
Now, it's important to understand that the false confession is not a monolithic concept. There are various types of false confessions. Actually, Kasson and Reitzman, back in, I think it was 1985, put forward what they referred to as a taxonomy of false confessions. And they identified three different types. The first is the voluntary false confession. This is when somebody voluntarily falsely confesses with no real inducement from the law enforcement officer. Various reasons why this might happen. Some people have a pathological need for notoriety. If we think back to like the Charles Lindbergh kidnapping, which was a national, probably international news story back in the early 1900s. His toddler son was kidnapped from his room. Hundreds of people came out of the woodwork and accept responsibility for that crime. Sometimes it's just people have that pathological need for notoriety. People also voluntarily falsely confess sometimes because they're looking for a deserved punishment that they should have received for another crime. So this might be an example where he had a father who was sexually abusing his daughter for years and was never caught or punished for that. He might accept responsibility for a current crime falsely to get the punishment that he felt he deserved for a previous. And that could be either conscious or subconscious. People might also voluntarily falsely confess to protect the truly guilty party. This might be when you pull somebody over on the highway and the individual accepts responsibility for the drugs that are found in the car when they really belong to the driver. They just don't want to get that person in trouble. And sometimes, whether it be through mental health issues, severe cognitive impairment, or whether it be somebody who's drunk or high at the time of the interrogation, they may falsely confess just because they have a problem identifying truth from fiction. So that's one. The second one that is probably more concerning is the coerced compliant false confession. These are the confessions that happen when a person is pushed into falsely confessing by direct inducements from the law enforcement interrogator. There's three general reasons they believe this may happen. The first is the person, the individual conducting the interview has created such a hellish nightmare of an interrogation room. The environment has become so toxic, so overly coercive, that the individual will say and do anything just to get their way, just to make their way out of the room, even if that means falsely confessing. The second two reasons you tend to find it is through people who are deliberately threatened into doing so. An example of that, one of the cases I remember reading, I think it was through the Innocence Project data, was the law enforcement officer pulled a sidearm, put it to the subject's head, and said, if you don't tell me what I want to hear, I'm going to shoot you and make it look like a suicide. Obviously, in a situation like that, it's not hard to see where a false confession may have originated.
Exactly.
And the third would be sometimes people falsely confess just in order to obtain an implied or specified reward. This is where you might find a child who is being interrogated. They confess because they're told, hey, if you tell me you did this, I'll let you go home to see your mother. Or an adult subject who's being interrogated, you ask them, if you tell me what I want to hear, I guarantee you'll get probation, or I guarantee you won't be charged. So those are three direct inducements that tend to cause people to falsely confess. And the third type of false confession put forth in the taxonomy is the coerced internalized false confession. This is where a vulnerable subject, like a child or somebody with cognitive impairments, mental illness, they may be presented with such overwhelmingly coercive interrogative techniques that not only do they end up falsely confessing, but they actually come to form false beliefs. They actually believe they committed the crime. So those are obviously the ones that are most concerning, because the individual believes they've come to do that. So in essence, that's the false confession. I agree with Dr. Danzer. It is really difficult to identify why somebody would do that, right? And it has been shown, even the research has identified, that when you ask prospective jurors, most of them, and probably most of us listening to this, would probably say there's nothing you could do to me, absent physical torture, that would make me admit to a crime that I didn't commit. So in other words, unless you put a drill into my kneecap, you're never going to make me confess to something I didn't do. That becomes a real problem for the expert witnesses who are testifying on this subject, because it goes very counterintuitive to our human sense of self-preservation. So,
definitely. Dr. Danzer, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think it adds to what Dr. Bayer's summing up for us. If you look at overall the evidentiary standards, in order to be arrested, the courts have upheld that you don't even have to have a preponderance to be arrested, right? So there could be evidence that means 40% likelihood of guilt, 30% likelihood of guilt. But if you look at the number of people who are arrested, how many of them resolve their cases through plea bargains? And so this would depend on whether you would consider that kind of situation a false confession or not. Like Dr. Baird said, you can make a reasonable argument both ways. But I think it would be important for us to pass on to the law enforcement community that there may be larger numbers of people who we think have done it and that it's resolved, and they really didn't.
Wow. All right. No, that definitely makes it a lot more complex than what a lot of people will think. Let's see, Dr. Byer, how common are false confessions then? And are there any specific types of crimes or cases where they're more prevalent?
And that really becomes a difficult question to answer, because ultimately we just don't know. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Innocence Project data routinely suggests, and it's routinely touted, that 25 to 30% of wrongful convictions are caused at least in part by false confessions. That's touted as proof that false confessions happen routinely. However, the research really, and the researchers really just don't know. And which I'm fine with, and I think that's great. The problem I have is, and I think it's kind of what Dr. Danzer was hinting at a little bit, is there's this little addendum to that statement that we just know it's a lot. In other words, we don't know how many false confessions there are. We just know there's a lot. So what has been used is often a metaphor, the iceberg metaphor, where with an iceberg, we all know that the portion you see above the waterline is just a small representation of what exists below the waterline, the part you can't see. And for that reason, a lot of times it has been suggested by people in the academic literature is that it's the same thing with false confessions. The few that we see are but a small representation of that unknowable number of false
Okay.
confessions that are out there. My concern with that, and the argument I would make, is if you don't know, you don't know. So anything else is just an educated guess, or maybe for some even a hope. But if you don't know how many false confessions there are, you just don't know. Now, when you consider looking back, for example, on the Innocence Project data, some of their cases are dating back 50 years.
Okay.
And when you look at that and you consider since that time period, we have probably had more than 61 million violent crimes in the country at that point. The 107 or so that they identified as wrongful convictions, that represents about 130 millionth of a percent of the total violent crimes that have occurred.
Right.
Now, are there others out there? Obviously, the question is we just don't know. When you think about it, though, and I think to give it context, according to the Innocence Project data, those 107, I think it was in 2020 when I looked at the data, those 107 cases of wrongful conviction, during that same time period, you had almost 1,800 Americans attacked by sharks. You had almost 8,500 people in America struck by lightning. So I think from that standpoint, the iceberg analogy or metaphor can be a little misleading. And I think what's important for those law enforcement officers, those criminal interrogators who are listening to us, it's important that you be aware of false confessions. But I don't think you should allow that to frighten you away from doing what you're supposed to do. And what you're supposed to do is to give a good, thorough, ethical, and professional interrogation.
Okay. All right. So a problem exists, but we don't know and can't rightly assume that it is a widespread common problem.
It's out. We just don't know, and that's the problem. Now, you had mentioned also, or asked as well, are there any particular crimes that they tends to lend itself to? What we tend to hear the most of are the rapes and then the homicides, because these are people who tend to get very long prison sentences. That doesn't mean that false confessions only happen in rape and homicide cases. When you look at it, actually, I did some research where I conducted qualitative interviews with interrogative specialists on the state level. And the ones who identified having received a false confession before, they identified that it tended to be in cases where there was very little evidence and the cases were not very important or not very serious. One example that comes to mind is one of the individuals I spoke with. He stated the investigation was of a person who reportedly stole a jar of change from a roommate. So we're not talking the crime of the century.
Right.
And this person gave the indication of, look, I just want to go home. Okay, I did it, because he knew the consequences weren't very strong.
Okay.
And so I think when you decrease the seriousness of the actual offense, as you mentioned, Dr. Danzer, when it's why do people confess falsely to crimes when there's such huge punishment? When you decrease that punishment just based on the nature of the crime, I think you tend to get even more false confessions. Now, in those individuals I spoke with, they said, look, we realized something was wrong with the confession. We didn't accept it. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Just because a false confession is elicited doesn't mean that it is all automatically accepted by either the law enforcement officer or the prosecutor.
Okay.
So
No, and that's a good point to bring up, that prosecutors and law enforcement has discretion in terms of if something does not seem valid.
absolutely.
Dr. Danzer, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, broadening, I think it's always important to try to put problems in perspective. How often is this really happening? One of the challenges in researching issues that don't happen every day, all day, it's not a very high frequency kind of thing, is that the consequences are still very high. That this is, we'll talk more about this later in today's talk, but when there is, a false confession to a murder that doesn't come out until later and it makes headlines, it causes big time problems.
Yes.
It's not the same thing, but it's like major acts of terrorism. It doesn't happen all the time, but it's such an impactful event that we're going to have trouble getting, the trusting public on board with. It doesn't happen that often, so we should dial it down. But there is some truth to that.
Okay.
And where I think we go with that is later on, we're going to talk about some of the things that law enforcement can do to even lower the risk. If there's populations that are more susceptible, what are some of the things that we would recommend as a way to lessen the likelihood that this is going to happen? And something that I'm going to emphasize later on is the techniques that cause more problems, in my opinion, I think law enforcement is good enough so that they're not needed anymore. I
Okay.
don't think you guys need the stuff that causes those confessions, and I'd
Okay.
be eager for the comments.
All right. Oh, wonderful. All right. Well, Dr. Dancer, you actually have a great lead-in for one of my follow-up questions for you. Would be what types of individuals are most likely to give false confessions? For example, factors such as age or intellectual disabilities, mental health conditions, or previous trauma.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
That's
how would that increase vulnerability?
Okay. And Dr. Baird mentioned some of this earlier as well. But what we know is that kids, especially younger kids, are more likely to say that they did things when they didn't. They're especially more easily influenced by adults. Adults that may have kind of an authority or a persuasive influence over them. I've had kids that were waived to adult court that it turned out later on that they agreed to go along with confessing because they were convinced that so doing would get them out very quickly, that they would be afforded forms of prestige and rewards thereafterwards, and essentially by an adult who, if they were to confess to the same thing, would most likely face much higher consequences.
Okay.
The other thing that we know that's very clear is that when people are very limited in their ability to reason between competing alternatives, when they're not so good at problem solving, when they're not so able to take information and put it together, we talk about that as being organized. Essentially, somebody who is often in a special education program in school, they may have been diagnosed with what we used to talk about as mental retardation. Now we talk about as an intellectual and developmental disability. These are youth that are often very limited in their abilities to use their brains to kind of navigate and adapt in the larger world, so that they become largely very dependent on adults around them, and to an extent where they become very deferential and agreeable and inclined to say yes.
Okay.
Those kind of cognitively limited individuals, you'll say, here are your Miranda rights. Do you understand them? They will say yes. Because in a lot of their histories, they've been picked on and bullied so much for being what would appear to be, in more colloquial terms, much slower than other kids, that it's very taboo to say, no, I don't understand, that is existentially very hard for them. And so those are a couple of the populations to look out for.
Okay.
The other thing that's happened as well is when people have severe psychosis, that they will sometimes admit to doing things that they didn't do based on different kinds of mental illnesses driving them to say so. I've had somebody that I worked with that was facing competency proceedings that was insistent that I tell the court that he was malingering so that he could walk in and ask for the death penalty. And I was pretty convinced that that was coming from mental illness.
Oh, wow.
I mean, the alternative that he was doing that based on the idea that maybe the courts would believe it and that it would be like a malingering strategy, did not sit well with me. I was not able to believe that. So these are some of the populations that we should be on alert when we're working with as possible false confessors.
Okay, definitely. And Dr. Byer, would you care to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think so. In addition to, adolescence being a risk factor, or mental illness or cognitive impairment, I think there's also certain personality facets that lends a person to being more likely to falsely confess. One of those is compliance. Some people, compliance is that degree to which you're just willing to go along because you don't want to become a problem.
Okay.
If you get somebody who's overly compliant, that may increase the likelihood that they're going to falsely confess. Another one of those is suggestibility. The suggestibility is the degree essentially to which somebody accepts the information that they're being told. So if you have an interrogator suggesting ideas during the course of the interrogation, if a person is highly suggestible, they may just accept what you're telling it as well. And I think one thing that not a lot of people tap into, but is something to consider as well, and I think Najdalski is the one who put forward, is because the annals of people who have been wrongfully convicted, especially those relating to false confessions, Black subjects tend to be overrepresented in this. And Najdalski had suggested that race may play a role in it as well, because Black offenders may be so worried about being perceived in light of negative Black stereotypes that they end up acting in a way during the course of the interrogation that makes them appear more nervous or anxious, and then the interrogator ratchets up the interrogative pressure and causes that. So race may be another issue to consider, something that has been put out there in the research.
Okay, interesting. Dr. Byer, the next question is for you. What particular type of interviewer or interview technique tends to increase the likelihood of a false confession?
And that's where a lot of this research is directed, is how do we stop this? What are the techniques? And the word they use that I find to be a little bit of a biasing term is tactics. The interrogative tactics that are employed can cause false confessions.
Okay.
One, in my opinion, undoubtedly the biggest pariah in this is the Reid technique. And I think there's two reasons why some of the academics have gone after the Reid technique. One of those is from the standpoint that Reid is really the most widely taught and widely disseminated interrogative practice or program really in the world. So everybody seems to know about it. Even if we have people listening to the broadcast here, even if they haven't attended a Reid technique, it's undeniable that part of the research or part of the techniques that they are using for interrogations currently were formulated somehow by the Reid technique. It was some kind of offshoot. So everybody's taken it. And Reid has been found to be effective in obtaining truthful confessions. So if you've got a technique that is routinely used and taught, most people have had it, and it's effective at doing its job, it's not a surprise that some, especially from the defense side of our adversarial system, have targeted the Reid technique. I think, just to give a quick example, I think part of that negative image or negative view of Reid stems from the fact that there are some researchers who are either misinterpreting or misquoting what the Reid technique says. And give you a quick example. I remember reading one study where the researchers suggested that what Reid directs is to, quote, further increase discomfort of the subject. Reid recommends you place them in a hard, armless, straight back chair. In reality, what Reid does say is the individual should be placed in a straight back chair because this is not a time for slouching. Slouching encourages a person to lose focus. For that reason, they recommend a straight back chair. They never said hard, and they certainly didn't say to increase the subject's discomfort. More importantly, what Reid also says is they recommend that the interrogator also be placed in a straight back chair.
Okay.
So, as they put it, this is no time for the examiner or the interrogator to become relaxed either. So, when you look at the way it was interpreted, you left out the fact that they recommend the interrogator be placed in the same type of chair. They added the word hard and they added the word to increase discomfort. So some of this misquoting, whether it's intentional or unintentional, I think has helped to cause Reid to be viewed in a negative light. So certainly, obviously, the Reid technique is one concern they have. Another might be like the false evidence ploy is another technique. Although we're allowed to lie to subjects during the course of a criminal interrogation, some in academia do not like the false evidence ploy. And what a false evidence ploy might sound like is, Eric, I know that you robbed that bank because when you jumped the teller counter, you left your fingerprint and we found your fingerprint on the teller counter. In reality, the interrogator does not have that evidence. They're just making that up to bolster their claims of guilt. It has been suggested within the literature that type of lying can increase the likelihood of a false confession. Also, other things that can contribute to false confessions, if you keep the person in the room for too long of a time period. Drizin and Leo conducted a study in 2004 where they looked at the first 125 proven cases of false confessions, which occurred as a direct inducement from law enforcement. And what they found is the average length of those interrogations that led to a false confession was 16.3 hours. So what you're talking about is having that person in the room for an egregious length of time. That tends to wear them down, they tend to lose focus, and it increases their anxiety and desire to escape the interrogation room. So things like that can also increase the likelihood of a false confession.
Okay.
And I think you had a second part of the question, if you can remind me on that.
Yes, it was what type of interviewer or interview technique tends to increase the likelihood of a false confession?
So those are some of the techniques. The type of interviewer, if you have an interviewer who is overly hostile, very judgmental towards the subject, overly coercive, tends to badger the subject, just tends to push them for an agreement. You did it right, you did it right, you did it right. That type of approach during the interrogation, that increases the likelihood of a false confession as well. And in reality, speaking with interrogative specialists over the years, I've come to find not only does that stuff increase the likelihood of a false confession, but it's not effective. Most people don't respond well to that. You know, nobody likes being yelled at and threatened and screamed at and things like that. So not only do you run the risk of a false confession, you also run the risk of shutting down the interrogation because the person just doesn't want to put up with that.
So it'd be counterproductive then.
Exactly right.
All right. And Dr. Danzer, would you care to add any comments to that?
Main thing that I wanted to add in is what the more recent and bigger research has found is that when you take the populations that are more susceptible to a false confession and you do the false evidence ploy, you're running a higher risk. Might be of help to the law enforcement community. When I've talked to officers about this, some of it will defend it very strongly. They say, no, this works. I've used this effectively before. I've heard from others that would say, when I've been caught in this, it has absolutely destroyed my credibility. So the way that I'm theoretically kind of putting this together is that it may be a high reward, high risk kind of option. And my challenge would be, well, if you didn't have that available, if law enforcement was physically incapable of using that kind of technique for whatever reason, what would you do then? And might you learn that you really didn't need it anymore?
Okay. All right. Interesting. No, thank you. I appreciate that. Well, Dr. Dancer, I have a question for you. How do factors such as prolonged interviews, isolation, sleep deprivation, and lack of access to basic needs impact the suspect's decision-making ability?
In here, what starts to happen is that you can start to lose a sense of being able to pay attention. You can start to feel, I can go over all the clinical words, but really you start to feel detached from yourself. You start to lose touch with reality, what's going on around you. You start to lose a sense of time and place. And it can be very difficult to organize yourself in a way that's necessary to have a more fluid and reciprocal and rational conversation. And that the longer that goes on, the more of a likelihood that if you're especially offered something that you really need, if you will just tell me this, I'll let you go to the bathroom, something more egregious like that.
Okay.
There's going to be a higher likelihood that you'll say what you need in order to get what you need. Just as a quick example to that, this was found in, and it's caused a lot of a problem in the prosecution of the 9/11 plotters and hijackers right now. A lot of the guilty knowledge that was acquired from them was done through coercive techniques. There's a question about how do we prosecute these guys? Now they're still down at Gitmo, and there's a lot of discomfort about just turning them loose. But this is not likely to be admissible evidence. So this has really gotten us into a lot of trouble so far. And part of what had led to a lot of the problematic evidentiary related disclosures was those kind of approaches, are essentially different kinds of practices that are designed to weaken somebody's psychological functioning, to keep them awake for long periods of time, to not feed them, to keep them in very dark rooms, to keep them in uncomfortable what we call stress positions, stuff like that, where the larger goal is to increase disorientation as a pathway to essentially increasing vulnerability and thereby facilitating disclosure. And the issue with it is that, yes, you may be able to get more words out, but they're not necessarily the truth.
Okay, nope. I see. And generally speaking, is there a certain cutoff of time, or does it just really vary on the individual and the techniques used before they start to have that significant impact?
The window period. From my recollection, Dr. Bayer's recall is accurate. There's a window time, and it's escaping me right now.
Because
but
you said
what was it
16
again?
hours was the average?
16 was the average length of time of people who have been proven to have wrongly or falsely confessed.
Yeah, and from my recollection of the study that's related to that, as the interview goes on and on and on, and it's for longer, the risk goes up.
Okay, and that makes sense. Dr. Baer, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Well, and I think kind of getting back to your second question that you just asked is what is that time period? It was interesting when I asked interrogative specialists on the state and federal level what they thought was an egregious length of time to interrogate someone. They usually said it kind of depends, and it kind of depends on various factors. Is the individual in the room voluntarily? Are they continuing to speak with you voluntarily? Are they asking for an attorney, which should immediately stop the interview anyway? Are they being given breaks? Are they being given requisite breaks, bathroom breaks, time to eat, smoke breaks, things like that? If you're receiving that, That number tends to be about 4 to 6 hours, somewhere in there. Most of them said once you start getting past 8 hours, it's way too long. So what's interesting is when you ask people who specialize in interrogation, what is too long of a time to interrogate someone? Their number of 8 is half of what so their level of egregiousness is half of what those actual 16-hour interrogations that led to false confessions.
Okay.
That's half of that time period, which indicates to me that 16.3 hours. Some of those lasting as long as 24 hours, according to the data. That's not routine interrogative practice. That's police malpractice.
Okay. All right. That definitely seems to stand out when you look at that.
For sure.
Let's see. Dr. Byer, what signs should interviewers look for to identify when a confession may not be reliable?
Well, and that's always a concern, right? Is because it has been suggested within the academic literature that the problem with false confessions is nobody in the criminal justice system can accurately identify one when they see them. That includes the defense attorney or the prosecutor or judges or juries, triers of fact. And it has obviously also been suggested, and probably the biggest problem, because they're the initial gatekeeper, is that law enforcement can't accurately identify a false confession when they have one. So some things I think you need to look for, and that the interrogators listening to this broadcast need to keep in mind. The very first thing to consider is the information, is the confession you receive consistent with existing case facts?
Okay.
If you're investigating a robbery, a bank robbery, and you know through video the individual came in with a nickel-plated .45 and came in through the front door, and the individual you're interviewing says, well, I came in the side door with a sawed-off shotgun, red flag should immediately appear to that interrogator. Hey, the confession you just received is not truthful. I think you also need to look for, is there any guilty knowledge that was provided? The true subject should know information that nobody else knows except the truly guilty person, which is why it's very important for an interrogator, before they go into an interrogation, to know to what extent has any of this been played in the media. You know,
Okay.
what is there any guilty knowledge that could have been put forward in the media that this person can grab onto? It's also critically important that whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, the interrogator must never feed that individual information to bolster the claims of their false confession, to make it sound more accurate, to match those existing case facts. You also should look for, is the confession you receive, does it contain consistent information? In other words, is it the same over and over again? Because what you should be doing is you should be going through that confession multiple times.
Okay.
If it's not consistent, if they are changing it, you need to be concerned, is this person being led? I think it's also important to keep in mind that on its face, at its base root, a false confession is a lie, right? So if you're lying, sometimes it can be very difficult to do a lie convincingly. So if the individual's information that they're providing just seems to be nonsensical,
Mhm.
I think we need to be mindful that, hey, the information we're obtaining is questionable. So I think what we can do as interrogators that I think is ultimately very helpful is to test the confession. The same type of tools we use to identify whether the information that's being provided during an interview is truthful,
Right.
we can use those same tools to identify whether a confession is truthful. For example, we tend to memorize things in a particular order, right? So
Yes.
we all know our ABCs from ABC to Z. If we were forced to use that same tune going backwards, most of us can't do that because we only memorize it unidirectional.
Okay.
So if you get a confession and you have that person go back through it, ask them to tell it to you in reverse. If they tell it to you in reverse and you're not hearing the same consistent information, be suspicious of that. Also, while they're giving their confession, as they're going back through it a second time, ask them to go through it and interrupt them deliberately.
Okay.
Whether it's throwing off, asking questions or pretending to take a text or something and say, I'm sorry, can you go back and say that again? If you keep taking them off their track, but they still maintain that ability to provide consistent and reliable information and details, you can feel a little more comfortable that what you've
Okay.
just received is a truthful confession. My biggest recommendation, though, would be is to throw in deliberate inaccuracy. So once the person tells you their confession, repeat it back to them and throw in deliberate inaccuracies to see if they correct you. Where you say, okay, so Eric, you woke up that morning, you decided to rob the bank, you jumped in your blue Prius, and no, it was my red Camry. Oh, okay, I'm sorry, your red Camry. If they're constantly correcting you in those deliberate inaccuracies,
Right.
it helps to show they're not simply going along with what you're telling them or what you're suggesting, that they do have the ability to stop you when something's wrong. And the very last thing I would suggest too to keep an eye out for is if your confession is preceded by a sense of unequivocal or equivocal statements, things like, listen, Eric, if you're saying I did this, I guess I did this. Or
Okay.
do you want me to just tell you I did this? Or if I tell you I did this, can I go home? If you're getting those, kind of prefaced or
Right.
questionable statements before the confession, you might want to be concerned about whether the confession you just received is truthful.
Okay. No, thank you, doctor, because what you just said kind of highlights earlier conversation about false confessions where people are lying, so you can use independent corroboration of evidence to verify for deception, but also consistency about that guilty knowledge. And then the other techniques are for people who may be overly compliant and may acquiesce to the
For sure.
interviewer. Dr. Dancer, would you care to add anything else?
Something I've done in cases where I've had a concern about the kind of overcompliance Dr. Bayer's talking about that I've found helpful in a number of cases is rather than starting an interview with more of a forced choice kind of approach, and you can pick one of these options. Tell me about what happened. I want you to start at the beginning of this day. No detail is too small. Brushing your teeth, go to the bathroom, tell me the whole thing. You go over the whole story. Sometimes this can take hours, and you write down your questions as you go, and then at the end you come back to it. And what I found sometimes is that people will tell me that they were in places at certain times when the crime happened somewhere else, stuff like that.
Okay.
Because if we've probably all heard about cognitive load, and that it's a lot more demanding to lie and to keep up a lie and to
Yes.
manufacture supporting details and to recall them later, especially under stress where there may be pressure to respond in a different kind of way. I found that can be very helpful.
Okay. Wow. So you like to start off with open-ended questions then, instead
Yeah,
of making their limited choices.
Tell me about what happened. I'd like you to tell me everything you can remember on this day, starting in the morning. No detail is too small. You talk and I'll listen. Go. And what I found in cases where people were being more disingenuous, and this is talked about in the literature and some of the law enforcement training materials that are out there as well, a lot of the times when you get a disingenuous response, it will be very short. There won't be a lot of supporting details. Sometimes you won't have people that'll volunteer information as they go also. You know what? Earlier on when I was talking 20 minutes ago, I forgot to tell you about something.
Okay.
That kind of thing is
Okay,
something
so
to look out
spontaneous
for.
correction then. Okay.
Yeah.
No, fascinating. All right. Well, thank you, doctor. Well, Dr. Dancer, my next question is actually, what alternative interview approaches can law enforcement use to lessen the risk of eliciting a false confession, such as rapport-based interview techniques or collaboration with mental health professionals?
One of the things that would lead me to be supportive of those recommendations that are found really throughout the science-based training materials and in the research, and I think that may be most intriguing to law enforcement, is that they are not counterable. If you're trying to develop a sense of getting information through building a good relationship with somebody, how are they going to defeat that through another measure? Coercive tactics can be counterable. There are things that you can do to essentially offset that. You can shut down, you can stop disclosing, you can say, I want an attorney. It's a little bit easier to see where things are and going and to respond accordingly as if on a chessboard, that kind of thing. One of the things that you can do as an alternative is, rather than presenting all the evidence right away, you can bring it up in a more of a slicing kind of form, that you can ask people to, tell their story of the day, leave no stone unturned, tell me everything that happened. And then later on, when you go back, you may present pieces of discrepant information. This goes along with how motivational interviewing works as well, is that you're looking to establish a sense of cognitive dissonance. So rather than telling people you're wrong here, you would present something that might create some discrepancy to say, that you told me this, but then we know this to be true as well. And then you be quiet and see how they respond. And this goes along with a more strategic presentation of evidence, which I would further reinforce, because again, what would be the counter to it? What would be the countermeasure that would make that no longer work?
Okay, no, fascinating. And that kind of goes along with what you said earlier, doctor, about guilty knowledge and being careful of what media has put out, because you don't want to disclose that evidence too early and therefore give information to the person you're interviewing, and then they would just kind of follow along your lead, I guess, so to speak. All right. So very nice. Dr. Berry, would you like to follow up with anything on
Kind
the
of
topic?
building off what Dr. Danzer just mentioned, when you think of, putting forward, hey, there's a discrepancy in a story. And I know there are many in the research that don't like the ability of law enforcement officers to lie during the course of an interrogation, and they don't like the false evidence ploy. Another way to do that many of us who have either interrogated before or maybe listening to this podcast is the bluff technique.
Okay.
Where the bluff technique is also a positive way, kind of, instead of actually having that information, where you're kind of suggesting, hey, you told us this, but we know this. You can also bluff an individual about that, where the false evidence ploy says, we found your fingerprint at the crime scene. The bluff technique says, Eric, we found a thumbprint at the scene. It's currently being analyzed. Is there any possibility that that thumbprint is going to come back to you? And that's very much accomplishes what you're suggesting there, Dr. Danzer, is where's the discrepancy? The nice thing about the bluff technique is there is no accusation made. I'm not saying that it's Eric's fingerprint that was found. I'm simply saying a fingerprint was found. And when I've talked to and presented on this, most law enforcement officers like this bluff technique approach much more than a false evidence ploy, because A, you can't get caught in a lie. As you mentioned earlier, you can't blow your reputation or your rapport you're trying to build with the person, because I never said it was your thumbprint. I just said a thumbprint was found. And it still puts that person in the position of having to come up with an explanation of why their fingerprint may have been left behind at the scene, which is very valuable diagnostic information, and it forces them to come up with a story, albeit most of us probably word it as, is there any reason we're going to find your fingerprint at the scene? Or is there any reason we're going to find your hair at the scene? Would be how probably most of us use that. But I think that's another decent way to do that as
interesting.
well.
And not quite as high risk as the false evidence ploy that you discussed earlier, Dr. Danzer. So if it is debunked.
You can't get caught in a lie.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's see, Dr. Danzer, how can agencies ensure continuous improvement when it comes to their interview and interrogation practices?
What I found to be most helpful in my own work as a forensic psychologist, it primarily interviews individuals after they've been arrested and they're in pretrial proceedings, is that I find that going over the same information over and over and over again, some of the trainings that I go to here as a student at FLETC, I attend repeatedly the same over, until it becomes muscle memory, so that when I really need to be able to recall something and use it to help me formulate what I'm going to say to people, it's right there. And so I think as much as can be possible for officers in the field is really developing an appreciation for lifelong learning, passing on lessons learned from the field, something that can be very helpful when conducting an interview, especially one that's more difficult, is to have somebody else watch the interview if a colleague is available. And then after the interview, rather than saying, how did that go? Asking them, how did I come off to you?
Okay.
And if there's somebody who is, a good friend or colleague, that they might be inclined, oh, you did very well and so forth, but really to press for details. Were there any mistakes that I made? I have a loving family. I'm not asking for reinforcement here. I want to do my job even better. And what would be very helpful is to hear your observations. And if they're being honest, a lot of the times it's going to hurt. But you go into your interview, I found, in a much better space to be in better self-control, and for me really to be Graham at my best, rather than to continue to make those same mistakes. And in a lot of my reading in the literature, there has actually been some more in the way of lessons learned in the military and law enforcement communities better than in mental health.
Really? Okay. Wow. And so I guess part of one of the side lessons on that is be very choosy about who you pick to critique you. Dr. Barrett, would care to add anything to that?
I would actually add to Dr. Danzer's recommendation, not only ask somebody else who's watching the interview how you did, but I have, in talking with people and professional interrogators over the years, many of them have actually asked the subject, let me ask you, why did you confess to me? So what you might find is very interesting information from that. And I've done that myself. And what I tend to hear and what other people have told me in these situations is what you tend to hear is the subject tell you, I've come to trust you. You treated me as a person. You showed me kindness. You showed me respect. I felt like I couldn't lie to you any further. So not only is it important to ask somebody else to critique you, you might want to ask the subject, why do you think you confessed to me? Why did you decide to tell me the truth? You might be surprised by the answer. I think it's also important to tap into the fact that it's my understanding we have almost 500 people listening to this broadcast. I think that's a clear indicator of the professionalization that has taken place in law enforcement. We have moved way beyond the third degree tactics of the 50s, 60s, 70s, things like that. This is people's profession. This is what they do for a living. And I've had interrogators tell me this over the years. This is what I do for a living. I want to be successful at it. I want to be good at it. I want to be ethical at it. Because ultimately, what we all know is at some point, if you obtain a confession, you're going to have to end up on the stand. And when you're sitting in the stand and that defense attorney stands up to cross-examine you, that is not a time where you want to have to answer for unethical, cruel, inappropriate behavior that you conducted while in the interrogation room. So I think this is a huge benefit that we all as a profession are trying to better ourselves at what it is we do.
Definitely. No, thank you for that. Well, actually, that's a really nice lead-in for my question for you, Dr. Barry.
Okay.
How do false confessions affect community trust in the justice system? And what steps can law enforcement take to rebuild that trust?
And although I disagree with some of the academic literature about how frequently false confessions occur, I want to make it crystal clear, false confessions happen. And when false confessions happen, they're an absolute travesty. Obviously, if a person goes to prison for decades of his life and loses his freedom, his family, his children, his way of providing for himself, for a crime he didn't actually commit, but he falsely confessed to, obviously it's a travesty for that subject. However, he's not the only person that faces a travesty in this situation. You also have society faces a travesty. And what I mean by that, if the wrong, and Dr. Danzer touched on this earlier, if the wrong person is put in prison, that means the truly guilty party is left on the street to continue raping, pillaging, and plundering society. So that brings a great deal of danger to the society or to our communities as well. So that becomes a travesty. It's also a travesty, or can be, for the interrogator who obtained that false confession. Because if you end up having somebody wrongfully convicted for a false confession that they gave you, it obviously is going to impact your career. It's going to impact your reputation. That's problematic. It's also a travesty for the departments or the municipalities where this law enforcement officer works. Because if he obtained that false confession while doing his job, the department, the municipality may very likely face a costly lawsuit. So it's also a problem for them. And overall, from a 10,000-foot view, there's a concern for society as well, because many people may not realize, but there are a lot of people in the United States that hates law enforcement, okay? When you see cries for defund the police or all cops are bastards, this types of thing, there's a lot of people out there who do not like police. Every false confession we receive or elicit as a profession increases that wall between us and society. It breeds distrust within the department. Now, one of the things I recommend is recording the interrogations, which was something coming from the FBI we never recorded for many, 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 many years. We're just starting to get into that. So I was initially hesitant about that. And part of it stemmed from the fact that the way it was presented in some of the literature, that if not for the watchful eye of the video camera, law enforcement will naturally devolve into abusing interrogation subjects. So I found that to be a little biasing, but where I think it's actually helped us is when you review the video of an interrogation that was done correctly, it's not a made for TV moment. It's not exciting. It's not, there tends to be no screaming and yelling and threatening, and certainly no guns put to the head. When an interrogation is done correctly, it's simply a conversation. So I think, just like body-worn cameras, I believe, have helped to exonerate more law enforcement officers against false accusations than it has term to help. I think once we have these recordings, that judges and juries and triers of fact can begin to look and see what actually took place in the interrogation room. I think what you're going to find, it's going to exonerate more law enforcement officers about claims that they abused the subject in the room or did something
Right.
unethical in the room, then it's going to end up hurting.
Okay. All right. No, thank you. Dr. Dancer, please share your thoughts on this.
Yeah. So I'm going to go off of, as part of my work on something where I bit depart from a lot of the field in this way is I listen to a lot of police recorded interviews related to the arrest in relation to trying to figure out whether the person's competent to face trial or not. Because, typically the interview is relatively longer. It's very stressful. The person has to answer questions going off in different directions. And you can get a sense of if the person can talk to law enforcement this way under such stress, are they able to talk to their attorney under what is probably a much less confrontive kind of interview? I can't count the number of recorded interviews that I've listened to, but what I've come away from those interviews listening as a psychologist is that I think, it's led me to question whether law enforcement really needs deceptive tactics at all.
Okay.
This is a hypothesis, but I think if law enforcement was not physically able to do it, let's just say that for the sake of argument, I think what would invariably happen is you'd have to find other ways to go about the interview. You'd intrinsically kind of move in other directions. You'd go to other personal strengths that you'd bring with you. The interviews that I've listened to where there was no deception, there was no coercion or anything, as a non-law enforcement professional, it is beautiful to listen to. It really is. This is going to, and if it sounds great to me, it's going to sound great to a jury. And I've heard good enough law enforcement interviews so often that I'm skeptical that the law enforcement community really needs this stuff. But again, I'm very receptive to comments to the contrary.
I think one question to ask though with that
Yeah.
is, what are you considering deception? Certainly,
Yeah,
hey, we
yeah,
found
yeah,
your DNA at the scene.
Yeah,
That's certainly a form of deception.
yeah.
But what
yeah.
about, hey, I think you're a good father for somebody who's
Yeah,
been sexually
yeah.
abusing their children? Clearly, I don't believe that. Is that considered deception?
Yeah,
You know.
what constitutes deception?
Correct.
Yeah,
So, but I
Yeah.
agree with you, and the research has shown that false evidence
Yeah.
ploy
yeah,
can increase. When you're saying we found your DNA, that increases that sense of inevitability.
Right.
That may increase a false confession. I don't know. I think some deception going to have to be left in from the
I
standpoint
think
of,
so. Okay.
I think
all right.
you're a good father. I think you were showing this child love. You weren't trying to hurt this child. Those could all be argued as well. Is that
Hmm.
deception?
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
I would, if I was talking to somebody who was, in one of the interview classes here, what I would want to ask is, if you couldn't say that, what would you say instead? And I'd be interested to hear. And I think what I'd
Yeah.
be listening for is, as a psychologist is, how is that going to impact report? If they had to go with something else, what would I envision to be how the interview would progress from there? No way to know, but I'm still wondering about what would be the alternative. If law enforcement couldn't do this stuff, would you really be worse off? I don't know.
Yeah. We may have another episode in the future. So I have a question for both of you. I just take turns, but the question would be, can you share an example of a case where a false confession occurred and what factors led to it? And Dr. Dancer, let's start with you on that.
The one that I made mention of briefly before, it was somebody who was accused of homicide that was very gruesome. He was very mentally ill. He showed symptoms that have not been established to even be fakeable or exaggerable. You can say, I'm hearing voices, this is how I'm feeling. But if you try to string words together in an illogical way, and if you try to say 30 words in a row that don't line up, you're not going to be able to do it because your brain is not disorganized. It's not a symptom that's feignable. And my point is that he was mentally ill, and that was reasonably well established. And what he would do with me is he would come in and say, look, just tell I'm malingering. Okay, I'm faking it. I'm not mentally ill. I've never been in a hospital. I don't need meds, nothing like that. He's been in a hospital 10 times before. I've got the records. It's established. And what my sense from spending many hours with him looking through all the records is that the mental illness was driving him to essentially want to die for the homicide as a form of almost kind of a retribution. He would talk about it like a prosecutor. This is going to this is going to make things better for the victim and the families. This is what they want. And it's actually not what they wanted. They wanted him to be in a hospital. And
Wow.
it was, a real experience for me to sit there and listen to this as a psychologist. It definitely gave me a lot to think about on the car ride home. But
Definitely.
it really gave me a sense that, this is a real thing that happened. That does happen. People will say things against their interest, even when so doing could cost them their life. It actually, it really does happen.
Wow. And so if there's an ideal or something that's strong enough, it could lead you to do that. So,
Yeah.
okay, interesting. Dr. Barrett, do you have an example that you'd like to share?
One I typically use when I'm presenting on this topic is the case of Byron Halsey, which
Okay.
took place back, I think it was 1985. He was living in a rooming house in Plainfield, New Jersey with his girlfriend, her 8-year-old son, and her 7-year-old daughter. And Mr. Halsey was supposed to be watching the children that evening. He got his friend Clifton Hall to drive him to another friend's house so he could party. Again, admittedly, not the greatest caretaker when you leave an
Right.
8-year-old and 7-year-old at home by themselves. But he was out for a couple hours. He came back. They couldn't find the children. They eventually found both children in the basement of the rooming house, murdered. Very vicious. I think nails were driven into the head of the 8-year-old boy. Both were sexually assaulted. So they began to look at, obviously, because he was the last person to be in contact with them, they began to look at Mr. Halsey and they interrogated him. And what they found is Byron Halsey had a 6th grade education. He had severe learning difficulties. A particular problem is over a course of 40 hours, law enforcement interrogated him for 30 of those 40 hours.
Wow.
He was administered a polygraph examination. He was told he failed the polygraph examination. Once he was told that and was directly accused of the crime, he fell into what they refer to as like a trance-like state and began speaking gibberish. And in this gibberish, he admitted to committing these crimes. Now, the admissions he gave did not match the existing case facts. So what the law enforcement officers did at the time is they took him into a room and sat with him from 6:30 at night until well after midnight, so almost 6 hours, and met with him and spoke with him until they came out with a 5-page confession that exactly matched the case facts. So not surprisingly, based on that confession, that written confession that matched the existing case facts, he was sentenced or charged with, I think, 2 counts of felony murder, 1 case of aggravated sexual assault. His sentence was 2 life terms plus 20 years, and then went to prison for it. Now, thanks to like the Innocence Project that took on his case, they used DNA technology, and they found out that the DNA on the body was actually Clifton Hall, the individual who'd given him a ride. So what he must have done is drove Mr. Halsey to the party, went back and murdered the children, and then Clifton Hall had the audacity to actually testify at trial against Mr. Halsey. So luckily, thanks to the efforts of the Innocence Project, 19 years later, he was exonerated.
Okay.
So this, to me, kind of typifies the type of case we're looking at from the standpoint of it's 40 years ago that this took place. Obviously, he has dispositional risk factors, which would make him more likely to render a false confession. And then he was subjected to what I would consider police malpractice in the form of being interrogated for 30 hours out of a 40-hour period,
Right.
and then deliberately feeding that individual information for the purposes of bolstering the confession that he gave. So right there, you can see where police malpractice and a vulnerable subject, when they combine, leads to disastrous effects.
Oh, definitely. There's multiple red flags in that example you gave.
For sure.
The last question I have for both of you be, and Dr. Danzer, we'll start with you. What final message would you like to leave with law enforcement officers about their role in preventing false confessions while supporting vulnerable individuals during interviews?
The big kind of take-home message that I'd like to share with law enforcement is, and this should be encouraging, for all, law enforcement is probably the most dangerous, most stressful job you can have. Despite everything that you guys deal with, all the verbal abuse, all the everything, the amount of complaints that are against law enforcement is relatively low. the amount of founded complaints is exceedingly low compared to how much happens in the way of incidents. And what this leads me to conclude is that law enforcement is doing a good job on the whole, and such a good job that these approaches, I appreciate Dr. Bayer's point about the word tactics. It is a way that it has kind of a jab in it. The stuff that carries such risk, law enforcement may be able to substitute it with something even better. I've heard it repeatedly on these interviews that I've listened to. And, this is ultimately this problem of false confessions that's out there. This is something that mental health and law enforcement can work together and do something to make happen much less. There's problems out there that aren't so fixable, but this is one of them. This is one of the things that we can do something about.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Dancer. Dr. Beer, any final comments that you'd like to offer?
Mine would ultimately be that false confessions do happen. I think they happen to a lesser degree than many in the literature would have you believe, but false confessions do happen. And as I discussed earlier, they are a travesty when they happen. However, what we can't do is throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are too many cases that have been solved. There's been too many instances of justice brought to victims through this important investigative technique known as the interrogation. And for many, that word interrogation has become a very negative term. You cannot, while those of you out listening to this, you have to be mindful of false confessions, but I don't want you to be afraid of them. Don't let it cause you to not do your job ethically, to not do your job professionally. Do what you're supposed to do, because the protection of our society ultimately depends on it, and the rights of the people that you're interrogating depend on it. So build rapport with people, be professional with people, treat them with respect, treat them with kindness. What you will find is you will get more information through that approach. Do your job correctly, do it ethically. All of us depend on you for that.
Thank you, Dr. Beer. Gentlemen, thank you both for being part of today's conversation on false confessions. I really enjoyed our conversation and your insights, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
For our viewing audience, this concludes the first portion of our broadcast. We'll take a 10-minute intermission and then begin our question and answer session. To our viewing audience, thank you for submitting your questions, and I encourage you to continue submitting your questions via the chat board during intermission. Welcome back. The Psychologically Speaking broadcast conversation on false confessions, what every interviewer should know. We're starting our question and answer session. Please continue to send your questions, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible during our remaining time. Our first question is for Dr. Danzer from Robert Rogers. How is a pretext phone call being compared to a captured and tortured POW? Is that the same level of risk?
A pretext phone call.
Was that similar? The example that you had given before was where you had a phone call to the suspect saying, I want you to admit and be responsible for your actions. I think that's the reference that I remember you making towards a phone call earlier.
And the commenter's name was Robert. I appreciate it took me a minute to draw the link. I think what's being gotten to is if there is a strong enough threat, will someone say that they did something that they didn't do? In the case of the post 9/11, the enhanced interrogation techniques, if they were sleep deprived long enough, if they were would they eventually just say, I did it, that
Right.
kind of thing. And then likewise, if somebody's on the phone and there's somebody who says, look, I don't want to cause you any trouble. I just want you to take responsibility for this, and I'm not going to go to the police. I see the parallel that's being drawn here. Of course, there's one that's likely to be more of a physical kind of immediate, really, it's been most roundly concluded to have constituted torture under the Geneva Conventions. But you're running the same kind of risk there, because essentially there's something that is the consequence of not giving in is very high. So,
Right.
you're looking at kind of having the same type of issue, even though they would seem to be very different circumstances.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Dr. Byer, from Vincent Pagnota. During the course of investigation, once someone is or has experienced cognitive dissonance and confessed to an incident, would it be pragmatic to reel them out of that state and re-engage on that topic?
That's an interesting question, Vincent. I appreciate that. And I think what I'm understanding you're saying is if that person has cognitive dissonance, has confessed, is it our responsibility to bring them out of that so that they're leaving in a more healthy sense? Um, I think there's a certain amount of catharsis once a truly guilty subject actually confesses to the crime they engaged in. So I think there's going to be some relief of that cognitive dissonance anyway, once they confess to that crime truthfully. So if I'm answering your question correctly, or understanding your question correctly, excuse me, I don't really see a reason to pull them out of that cognitive dissonance. I think it'll happen through the confession process itself.
All right, thank you, Doctor. And Vincent had a follow-up question. Are there tangible indicators that are indicative of someone leaning towards making a false confession while in a state of cognitive dissonance? So it's a slightly different question.
I think it's really those same factors that we talked about earlier. Is the person, are you seeing those equivocal statements? Are you beginning to see information that is not lining up? I'm not sure, Dr. Danzer, are you able to help? I'm not.
Yeah, I think I would, I'm thinking about this like in a forensic psychological kind of way. It's good. Are there indicators if they're on the fence? Is there a sense that they're going to go towards being a false confession? And no, I don't think there's anything concrete that would tip you off that way that is strong enough evidence-based.
Other than those factors we talked about earlier,
Okay.
things you might want to be on the lookout for.
Yeah, the behavioral indicate. Yeah.
And if we could just kind of help the audience, just explain, some people may not be familiar with the term cognitive dissonance is. And so, gentlemen, would one of you care to actually give us a working definition of that?
When you have somebody who would seem to be kind of riding the fence, they're ambivalent about something. I kind of think this, I kind of think that. I'm not sure. I haven't really made up my mind. What the research from our field would suggest is in those circumstances, you want to ride the fence with them, that you want to help, you want to ask clarifying questions, you want to point out possible discrepancies, but your response does not want to suggest to the person which side of the fence you fall on. You want to ride the fence with them so that when they come to their own resolution, it's going to be much more solid. It's typically going to be a lot better for rapport building and further disclosure.
All right, thank you. Let's see, I have a comment from Mark Fallon. While Reed has been found to produce confessions from guilty suspects, it has also been found to be effective in obtaining confessions from the innocent. So that one wasn't a question, it was just a general comment. But was there any thoughts on that?
I would absolutely agree with that. And even a lot of the literature suggests that the techniques, to include the Reed technique that law enforcement uses, not only can produce truthful confessions, it also can produce false confessions. Right. My point in considering that, then, it's almost like a recipe for cookies. It's saying, if you follow this recipe, the cookies will come out golden brown and perfect. But if you follow the recipe, you'll also burn the cookies. My thought then is, at that point, it's not so much the recipe that's causing the issue, it's the chef himself. He's not doing something he's supposed to be doing, like keeping the individual in the room too long, threatening them, giving them promises of leniency, things like that. So, Mark, I would agree with that. It's and that looks more towards the technique versus the actual interrogator and his potential misbehavior.
Okay. All right. Dr. Danzer, any comments on?
The main thing that comes to my mind as somebody who has not admittedly done a law enforcement interview is the other techniques that I have listened to and seen work very well just seem much more preferable under most circumstances. For example, when I've seen officers that have worked towards getting information from the suspect that is contradicted by the evidence, that is going to hold up in court. It's going to look great to a jury. Again, there's no countermeasure to it. given the costs in the, higher risk, higher reward, I think the alternatives that law enforcement has in the tool belt just seem so much more readily usable. And, to have a competing level of relative success and what would be the cost of doing those instead. That's what comes to my mind.
Okay, well, thank you. Let's see, I have another comment. Tom Lambert says, State of Virginia made the use of false information and fake documents interrogations of juveniles unlawful starting July 1st. So that is good to know. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for
I
sharing.
think that's great.
All right. Let's see, Dr. Beyer, from Stephanie Zaka. Let's see, I'm trying to think how to actually read this. Would prolonged interviews reduce the effectiveness of the interview or of the interviewer? Would be the question. And then, have there been studies on the length of time on interviewing is effective? And so I think what's being asked is anything about have prolonged interviews reduced the effectiveness of the interviewer? Since we're talking about the recipient of that, how about the interviewer themselves? Are they being effective?
I think you get a kind of garbage in, garbage out technique to that, because if you have an individual in the interrogation room for 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18 hours, and you're not getting anywhere, not only is that person becoming worn out and you run the risk of getting a false confession, but also you're getting worn out as the interrogator and you run the risk of making maybe poor decisions.
Right.
So I actually heard somebody once say that keeping somebody in the room too long and depriving them of sleep is like interviewing a drunk subject. You'll get information, but you can't necessarily trust the information you're getting.
Okay.
I think it's really the same if you keep an interrogator in the room that long. So.
No, that makes sense. Dr. Dancer, any comments on that as well?
Yeah, on a personal level, when I've been up on the witness stand testifying as an expert witness for hours and hours, I start to feel a sense of being disoriented. If you're talking to a suspect who's under, great stress with the threat of being arrested, especially for serious crime, I don't see how you as a law enforcement interviewer could stay organized, very much under control, kind of a sense of where you were, how do you stay you at your best?
Right.
I mean, how do you possibly do that for 8 hours?
And I think what you're getting then at that point too is just the going round and round and round and round.
Yeah.
I think you run the risk of you're no longer applying ethical techniques. You're now probably just badgering the person.
Okay.
And I don't want to have to be the one who sits on the stand and admits to, I had him in the room for 16 hours.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I would wonder, adding to that, how would you explain that? The defense attorney says, why did you explain why the 16-hour interview? What are you going to say that is going to sound non-coercive, non-punitive? How would you justify that?
Okay. That makes sense. Are either of you aware of any studies that have been done on length of time for effective interviews?
I know the people I spoke with on the state level and on the federal level who specialize in criminal interrogations. Right. I think one put it best. I was speaking with a woman and she said, listen, mama wants to go home. So there comes a point where the interrogation just becomes too long. And the people I spoke with, it tends to be that 4 to 6 hour time period, so long as they're receiving breaks and
right.
Meal breaks, smoke breaks, things like that.
Okay. All right, Dr. Dancer?
Yeah, no, I'm not aware of a bigger study that would establish, how long and really looking hour by hour, what's the effectiveness, how you would judge that. But if you would look at the association between longer interviews and savage prosecution, if you would consider the absence of that to be a form of evidence, then it would definitely reinforce the really the dangers in keeping interviews going on and on based on a sense of really anything but diminishing returns.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Let's see. Dr. Beyer, from Robert Rogers. It's worded, so polygraphs after the fact for comparatives alongside corroborative evidence. So what I think they're asking is, how do polygraphs compare alongside corroborative evidence after that polygraph is given?
Meaning testing people after they've confessed, or?
Um, I could interpret the question a couple different ways, so I don't know if using the results of a polygraph, say, basically deception was indicated on this polygraph. How would you use that? Would you use that in a similar manner compared to corroborating evidence?
Well, and I think, and this may not be exactly what Robert is
Yes.
asking, but it's important that people realize, especially law enforcement officers who are interrogating criminal subjects, if you obtain a confession, that's not the end of your investigation. That's just the jump off point for a new area of investigation. And what that is to corroborate and verify the information that you had just received. Now, I know some have suggested that a prosecutor will automatically prosecute just based on a confession alone. But in the individuals that I have spoken with, in my own personal experience, the prosecutor doesn't want to lose a case. So they always want additional evidence in the event that the confession gets thrown out. So I think it's important to keep in mind, and again, Robert, I don't know if this gets to the question you're asking, but I think a polygraph is good in identifying whether the person's being truthful. I think the investigation afterwards to corroborate that information is just as important as what a polygraph might have told you in the examination room. So.
Right. No, in my experience, I've always treated it as any statement. You try to have that independent corroboration with other known evidence, other supporting statements from other victims' witnesses. So,
agreed.
All right, Dr. Dancer, any comments on that? We think we're interpreting the question.
Yeah,
right
no,
way.
I would go along with, if you can find enough cross-referenceable evidence, especially evidence that's admissible. Part of the challenge with the polygraph is that it's not going to be admissible in a proceeding under a lot of circumstances, at least. And it does, however, work as an interrogation tool. That's what they found in a lot of the psychological research that's relevant, is that it does help to facilitate more disclosure, so that there can be an advantage that way. But what research has consistently found is that when you can cross-reference different forms of evidence one against another, that the likelihood of really a wrongful conviction, as Dr. Bayer talked about before, is exceedingly low. And so that would be my recommendation is, can you mainly seek to get evidence that corresponds across the board?
Great, thank you. Dr. Danzer, this question is for you from Carrie Johnson. Can you recommend some reliable training materials and books that are readily available to investigators?
The main recommendation that I would offer, and not just because I'm here, but I would say, I've come to the advanced interviewing training for law enforcement officers that was here. I did it as a form of collateral training. I found it very helpful for my training as a psychologist. I found that, there are different, science-based interviewing textbooks that if you look up science-based interviewing on Amazon, you'll come up with tons of stuff. But I found that better training for interviewing has been in person and actually going to class where you can try out the practices. It's been a little bit difficult for me personally to get up in front of the class and try it out myself. When I've done it, the dividends have been huge. So that's what I would recommend. Not only go to the class, but swallow the lump in your throat. And when it's time to volunteer, put your hand up.
I would share that experience as well, Dr. Danzo. I appreciate that. And not an advertisement for FLETC at all, but FLETC does offer advanced interview training both here at our facilities as well as what we call exports. And so we do travel to deliver advanced interview training as well. Dr. Bird, do you have any questions on that?
Not so much any particular book, but certainly what I would recommend is attending classes like these or listening to broadcasts like these. What you find, and I know being a career polygraph examiner, we would have yearly conferences, and undoubtedly when you sat and met with somebody or talked with another examiner, you picked up something new. And we often have this statement, nobody's their own originator. And what you will find as you become more involved in interrogation and taking interview and interrogation training, there are things that are going to work for you and there are things that are not going to work for you. There are things you're going to be able to sell, things you're not going to be able to sell. So part of it is personal preference. And my recommendation would be talk to other professionals in the field, pick what you like, pick what you don't like, and continue to fill that toolbox, because undoubtedly at some point there's going to be some time that you can use something you haven't used before. So try out what works for you.
All right, great. Well, thank you. Let's see, comment from Marina Sorchinsky. It is great to see that Dr. Beyer is actually recommending videotaping of interrogations. Well, thank you, Marina. Appreciate that. Let's see. For both, this is from Vincent Pagnota. And let's see. In your opinion, would employing minimalization techniques be considered a form of deception that would lead someone to possibly false confess under the pretense that they are viewed in a better light?
The research that I'm aware of would say that if there is a quid pro quo kind of conversation,
Okay.
then you're in trouble. If this doesn't, I've seen some commentary in the research articles that says, essentially we, the researchers, are worried about psychological justifications. Could that increase susceptibility? I don't think that there is data that would support that that's been affirmed. But that if there's minimization along the lines of, this was a voluntary manslaughter, this wasn't premeditated, right? There's a quid pro quo in there that is going to be thrown out in court.
Right.
And again, the complication that you'd have to think about is if roles are reversed, if you're on the other side of this, and there's a possibility that if you just admitting to it could potentially save you from the death penalty and maybe get you 10 years in prison, let us not be so noble to think that we wouldn't be tempted. Let's have an honest conversation. Okay, that is going to be tempting, and that's really the importance of this topic today.
Definitely.
Well,
Dr.
one,
Beer?
I think, to consider, especially like us that have worked within the federal system, I know, having worked in the federal system, if you accept responsibility for your crime, you automatically get 2 points deducted
Yes.
from according to the sentencing guidelines. So if you were to go in and suggest to somebody, if you confess, you're more likely to get a lesser sentence. You're likely to have 2 points deducted from your sentence if you accept responsibility. That is not a lie. That is minimization, but that's a truthful statement. I think minimization, what we need to be mindful of is if you are promising somebody leniency in exchange for their confession, the quid pro quo that Dr. Danzer is talking about, that's problematic.
Yes.
However, if you are tapping into what I believe is just a reflection of Freud's concepts of defense mechanisms and start using rationalization and things where, hey, if the bank paid you more money, you wouldn't have to steal from the bank.
Mm-hmm.
We're really just tapping into time-tested theories that have existed from Sigmund Freud forward. So I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, I backing that up. I have not seen research that would disconfirm that. Some commentary that I've seen, this might be helpful, and I think that this was based on, anecdotes from experience, is that if you can get those psychological justifications to tie into the person's early life, if you can somehow provide as the interviewer what the person was missing from their early family dynamic, then it's going to be even more effective. Not just that it's rational, but that if it really ties into what's known about their history, if this is somebody who needed money and that's where you're going, the potency is going to be higher.
Oh, wow. Okay. So making it even more relevant to long-term character memories type of attachment.
If you can if you know about their early life and it ties in well, then it's more likely to get the disclosure going.
Oh, wow. Okay, great. Well, thank you. Let's see. From Brandon Selke, this isn't directed to anyone. If following the proper safeguards, does FLETC still endorse rationalize, project, minimize themes during the interrogation? We really don't currently teach a lot of rationalizing, projecting, or minimizing. We tend to follow the motivational interviewing tenets and also Cialdini's principles of persuasion, and that's what we typically teach during our rapport-based interview classes. But thank you for the question. All right, let's see. This one is a little broad. It can be for both. It's from Byron Brackenberry. Can you give a brief discussion on entrapment?
Byron, I'm against it. So I'm not sure how to answer that one. I'm obviously against entrapment.
All right. I mean, that's slightly different than the false confession. And I really don't want to try to get into a legal discussion. It's really not the proper forum for that. But if there's any thoughts with any type of psychological studies that you're aware of regarding false confessions and entrapment, if there's any that you're aware of, that would be
And
great.
the only thing I can maybe think that Byron's referring to is if we start looking at false evidence ploy,
Mhm.
where you're pretending to have evidence that you
Right.
don't actually have, is that approaching the level of entrapment? I think that's the difference between pretending you have it and actually placing something on somebody.
Right.
Yeah, all I can say, Byron, is obviously I'm against it as a retired FBI agent.
As am I. Dr. Danzer, anything
I-
that you're aware of?
I was going to say it's a legal defense, of course. The exception to it is, were you susceptible anyway? If I go out and get caught selling drugs 6 times and then I got caught a 7th time, I can't say that I was entrapped to do it by law enforcement because I was susceptible previously. My larger position, based on my knowledge of the forensic psychological literature, is that it's probably not a subject that a psychologist would have expertise on. I could comment on it, I could talk about it, but
Right.
if I was asked to provide an expert opinion on the entrapment defense, that's what I would say is I don't think that there's science on this.
Okay.
I think it's a law enforcement and judge issue to sort out through the defense.
Right. No, and I was more familiar with that term used for legal defenses and
Yeah.
arguments as opposed to psychological. So
Yeah.
thank you for that. I have another comment from Mark Fallon. The movement to ban deception in interrogation does not include rapport building. It is about material facts. All right. So Mark, thank you very much.
And I think what Mark's tapping into there, that gets back to what we were talking about earlier, deception being, hey, I'm claiming that I have evidence that I don't actually have, versus claiming that, I think you're a good father and really you're not. So
All right.
thanks. And I thank you to Mark for that.
Great. Mark, thank you.
Yeah, I was going to, something that might be helpful as well. The only counter argument that I've heard in hearings where, the defense has been trying to undo the report, all they can really say is, essentially, were you trying to build rapport in a kind of manipulative way? Were you
Okay.
leading my client to believe that you were their friend when you were really not, that kind of thing?
Okay.
In my experience, and from what I recall of the jury decision-making literature, it doesn't carry much weight. Juries are not persuaded by that. Because what's the counter argument? You don't want law enforcement to build good relationships and to encourage honest disclosure, right? So again, I think the thing that really goes to science-based interviewing on the whole is that there's not something that suspects can do or their attorneys can do that can very easily defeat it, and in the way that the other techniques do run a higher risk.
Okay. All right, well, thank you. Let's see, Dr. Danzer, I have a question for Brandy Carter. A lot of trainings I have been to recently have recommended empathy or rapport building interrogations as preferable current best practices. What are your thoughts on this, or is there something better out there?
Yeah, this might help when I meet with somebody who is, not wanting to talk to me. And I can just kind of get that feel right away. I find that it's often quite helpful to start by saying, I'm Graham or Dr. Danzer, either is fine. I'm sorry we're meeting this way. I'm sure this is not the plan. There may be an attorney that's saying, well, that's manipulative and you're being disingenuous. And I would say, no, I mean it. I would rather not have to meet somebody for the first time in jail. This is probably stressful. What I would say from my experience and what I understand in the literature is that if what you're saying is genuine, if you really believe it, it's going to come out in a way that's more likely to build the relationship and going to further disclosure. So that if you can say something that has that, I want to build a relationship quality and it's sincere, that's going to be even better.
Okay.
But that it would certainly go towards science-based interviewing. And again, I would say what's the risk of doing so?
Right. Okay. Yeah. Seems to be a low risk type of approach. So,
yeah.
Great. Thank you. Let's see, Dr. I have a question for you from Marina Sorchinki.
Sorchinsky.
I don't see an S in there. Why do you continue to defend the coercive read technique when evidence-based alternatives, such as the PEACE model, have been shown empirically shown to be more effective in eliciting truthful confessions while significantly reducing the risk of false ones?
Okay. And Dr. Sorochinski, I appreciate the question. Some of my issue stems from the fact that the study of the Reid technique has taken place in academic laboratories in universities and colleges, which makes sense. They're the ones who are conducting the research. The problem is, I think that research, because it is so artificial, can lead to flawed conclusions. An example of that might be, I think it was 1999, Caston and Fong conducted a research study in which they looked at or posited that exposure to the Reid technique will increase the subject's likelihood of identifying deception in another person. In other words, for law enforcement officers who take the Reid technique, they're more likely to find deception. And the study they conducted, they gave 30 minutes of Reid training to some college students and then had them sit down and watch videos of a non-college student criminal being interrogated by a non-college student law enforcement officer about whether they may or may not have been involved in a mock crime. And not surprisingly, 30 minutes of Reid training increased their identification of deception. Again, you have a non-cop interrogating a non-criminal about a non-crime after being given 30 minutes of Reid training. I see where you may have come up with that conclusion in the laboratory. My concern is when academia or these researchers automatically go into court and say that this extrapolates into the real world of law enforcement.
Okay.
So I think part of the problem with not only misinterpreting and misquoting Reid is the fact that sometimes the way it's studied, and again, we certainly can't hurt human subjects, and I'm not proposing that, but because the environment is so artificial, sometimes the conclusions they arrive at are inherently questionable. It's apples to oranges. So that's part of my concern. And again, the Reid technique, and as far as the peace model, I just had a law enforcement officer tell me recently that he was speaking with somebody in England who has used the peace model, and they said they're thinking of getting away from it because it decreases their ability to get confessions. That's anecdotal, but I'm just telling you, there is no one surefire way to stop false confessions. And what you have to do is you have to put trust in the people that you hired, the law enforcement officers, the people that you've trained, who has to go through a background check and a polygraph examination and a psychological examination and training and all of these things just to get the job. We have to put trust in law enforcement officers. And if you can identify a place where that individual has done something wrong in an interrogation room, then go after him. But I think it's too easy to simply say this interrogation technique is all bad, and anybody who uses it, we must assume obtained a false confession.
Okay.
That's, I think, the bias we're working at or looking at here.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Baer.
Just, it's going to be a little bit off center, but I think we would all agree that kind of exploring and trying to figure it out for ourselves always has benefits. What I would say is, regardless of the model that is most familiar, that you've had the most training in, come to FLETC's advanced interviewing training for law enforcement. It doesn't teach Reid, it teaches another approach, but take the class, try it out, and see what works. I'm not a law enforcement officer. I went to the training and I found it extraordinarily helpful to my work as a forensic psychologist. So come down here and try it out.
Great, thank you, Doctor. Our next question would be from Karen Sedman and Dr. Danzer. Let's see. It looks like, so the question would be, could you elaborate on how studies show the control call approach in sexual assaults has lent itself to more false confessions?
Yeah, good question. Where's the evidence for this? There was I don't recall the title immediately offhand. There was a recent article that was it was a big review study that was put out by one of the journals in APA. And that was referenced as, it was like a summary of another study. I don't remember all the, I didn't go into that other study to get all the details. But I've had experiences where there have been people that I've talked to who were found incompetent. I was talking to them about what happened, and the main evidence against them was essentially the control call, that they confessed to it, and there were disconfirming details. You know, like we talked about, you know, trying to get information from the interview that is contradicted by the evidence. They didn't do it. It was they were exonerated based on other information. But there is there is a secondary reference of that in a study that I don't immediately recall the title to. But good question to the audience. You know, tell me the evidence for this.
Thank you very much. And it appears that we are out of time. Gentlemen, thank you both for being part of today's conversation. This will conclude our broadcast, and Dr. Beyer and Dr. Dancer, thank you for sharing your time and your expertise with us. I really appreciate it, and I learned a lot, so thank you very much. Thank you, audience, for your participation and your insightful questions. Special thank you for our technical staff, so Robert and Relisha, who keeps everything running smoothly behind the scenes. I hope you have found today's broadcast to be informative and worthwhile. The Behavioral Science Division wishes to provide you with additional resources that you'll see on the flyers, and our contact information, additional resources, and information on our September 4th Psychologically Speaking broadcast. That will be on post-active shooter events. Your feedback is very important to us. Please remain and take a moment to complete the online survey. Again, thank you for joining us today, and we hope you'll join us in September for more continuous conscious conversations.